Hello. I am Professor Roy. Let us watch a presentation on the economic approach on Becker analysis. Brought to you by one of my students, Miss Frida.
Thank you, Professor. Hello everyone. My name is Frida. Please allow me to explain about the economic approach on Becker analysis, according to his Nobel Prize award. First of all, let us talk about the man Gary Becker himself. Gary Stanley Becker was a professor of economics and sociology at the University of Chicago. He was described as the most important social scientist by the New York Times. Becker was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1992. He also contributed to the analysis of human capital and credited with the rotten kid theorem. Becker said that discrimination against outsiders have always existed, but with the exception of a few discussion of the employment of women, economists wrote a little on this subject before the 1950s. He began to worry about racial, religious, and gender discrimination while a graduate student, and used the concepts of discrimination coefficient to organize his approach to prejudice and hostility to members of a particular group. Becker's discipline-changing insight was to frame race discrimination within a market context, using the framework to analyze and identify reasons for the black-white wage differential. In this way, he was able to illustrate standard features of economics while applying them to the questions of why wage differentials exist and persist between race. 3 features of the economic approach define Becker analysis. First, he used a rational individual, utility maximizing model. People often caricature the rational player as a poor representation of human behavior. But at its simplest, the model recognizes that we, unlike atoms or rocks, actually have some interest in the outcome of things, and generally attempt to affect those outcomes and thereby pursue our own interests. Second, Becker's model was based on the idea of a market, or more generally, interaction between people. The market represents one form of social interaction, and economics uses all sorts of other contexts in which people interact, such as dating and marriage. Third, his model used the economic notion of an equilibrium, a point at which individuals both act in their interests and interact with one another. Let us see how employer discrimination works. Let us assume that we have 2 types of workers, which are white workers and black workers. Our production function is given by the following equation: output is equal to A times the number of whites employed added with the number of blacks employed. The marginal product of labor of the whites is equal to A, which is also equal to the marginal product of labor of the blacks. It means they are equally productive, and any difference in wages are the products of discrimination. This tells us also that firms should consider them as perfect substitutes. Now we are also going to assume that there are 2 types of firms, the colorblind firm and the discrimination firm. The colorblind firm is going to hire the cheaper worker. They will hire blacks only if the wages are cheaper than the white's wage, and vice versa. On the other hand, the discrimination firm believe that the wage of the blacks is equal to wage of blacks times 1 plus a discrimination coefficient. Let's call this the utility adjusted wage. They will only hire blacks if the utility adjusted wage is smaller than the white's wage, and vice versa. Now assuming that we have a segregated workforce, the white firms will only hire white workers for a white wage. In the black firms, the more discriminating they are, the less black workers they will hire, and this is based on the utility adjusted wages the company has. All of this depends on the discrimination coefficient in each company. We can also see the effects of discrimination in the millennial generations. The modern domestic workforce contains greater shares of women and minorities than it did 14 years ago, according to a recent Career Builder study. Across the healthcare system, in for-profit, non-profit and government primary care centers, the pressure is on primary care providers to use the same limited time and resources that they've always had to deliver preventive care, chronic care, acute care, evidence-based care and charitable care to an increasing number of patients, who bring with them increasing demands and expectations for medical care. This results in the growing reliance on a minority labor force. In the 1950s and 1960s, intellectual discussions of crime were dominated by the opinion that criminal behavior was caused by mental illness and social oppression, and that criminals helpless victims. Becker was not sympathetic to the assumption that criminals had radically different motivations from everyone else. He explored instead the theoretical and empirical implications of the assumption that criminal behavior is rational. Rationality did not necessarily imply narrow materialism. It recognized that many people are constrained by moral and ethical considerations, and did not commit crimes even when they were profitable and there was no danger of detection. The amount of crime is determined not only by the rationality and preferences of would-be criminals, but also by the economic and social environment created by public policies, including expenditures on police, punishments for different crimes, and opportunities for employment, schooling, and training programs. Clearly, the type of legal jobs available as well as law, order, and punishment are an integral part of the economic approach to crime. Becker's theory acknowledged that a society could not eradicate crime beneath a certain level. For example, if 25% of a supermarket's products were stolen, it would be very easy to reduce this rate to 15%, quite easy to reduce it until 5%, difficult to reduce it under 3%, and nearly impossible to reduce it to 0%, a feat that would be so costly to the supermarket that it would outweigh the benefit, if it is even possible. For example, on how crime affects the economy, here is an illustration of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. It is a United States military prison located within Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, also referred to as Guantanamo or Gitmo, which fronts on Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Since the inmates have been detained indefinitely without trial and several inmates were severely tortured, this camp is considered as a major breach of human rights by Amnesty International. It is also the most expensive prison in the world, providing maximum security and amenities for the prisoners inside it. Human capital analysis starts with the assumption that individuals decide on their education, training, medical care, and other additions to knowledge and health by weighing the benefits and costs. Benefits include cultural and other non-monetary gains along with improvement in earnings and occupations, while costs usually depend mainly on the foregone value of the time spent on these investments. Becker's work on human capital began with an effort to calculate both private and social rates of return to men, women, blacks, and other groups from investments in different levels of education. After a while it became clear that the analysis of human capital could help explain many irregularities in labor markets and the economy at large. It seemed possible to develop a more general theory of human capital that includes firms as well as individuals, and that could consider its macroeconomic implications. Human capital theory gives a provocative interpretation of the so-called gender gap in earnings. Traditionally, women have been far more likely than men to work part-time and intermittently, partly because they usually withdrew from the labor force for a while after having children. As a result, they had fewer incentives to invest in education and training that improved earnings and job skills. During the past 20 years all this changed. The decline in family size, the growth in divorce rates, the rapid expansion of the service sector where most women are employed, the continuing economic development that raised the earnings of women along with men, and civil rights legislation encouraged greater labor force participation by women, and hence greater investment in market-oriented skills. In practically all rich countries, these forces significantly improved both the occupations and relative earnings of women. Becker has done research on the family, including analyses of marriage, divorce, fertility, and social security. He first analyzed fertility starting in 1960. The rational choice analysis of family behavior builds on maximizing behavior, investments in human capital, the allocation of time, and discrimination against women and other groups. The rest of the lecture focuses on this analysis since it is still quite controversial. Writing a treatise on the family is the most difficult sustained intellectual effort Becker had undertaken. The family is arguably the most fundamental and oldest of institutions, Some authors trace its origin to more than 50,000 years ago. The treatise tries to analyze not only modern Western families, but also those in other cultures and the changes in family structure during the past several centuries. In the 1960s he and Jacob Mincer developed the new home economics, of which Becker's theory of allocation of time is a centerpiece. Becker argued that such decisions are made in a marginal cost and marginal benefit framework and that marriage markets affect allocation into couples and individual well-being. His research examined the impact of higher real wages in increasing the value of time and therefore the cost of home production such as childrearing. As women increase investment in human capital and enter the workforce, the opportunity cost of childcare rises. Additionally, the increased rate of return to education raises the desire to provide children with formal and costly education. Coupled together, the impact is to lower fertility rates. His theory of marriage was published in 1973 and 1974. Among its many insights are that, 1. Sex ratios, the ratio of men to women in marriage markets, are positively related with wives' relative access to consumption in marriages and, 2. Men with higher incomes are more likely to be polygamous. He published a paper on divorce in 1977, with his students Robert T. Michael and Elizabeth Lanz, hypothesizing that divorces are more likely when there are unexpected changes in income. Many of these insights on fertility, marriage, and divorce were included in Becker's A Treatise on the Family, first published in 1981 by Harvard University Press. In the 1950s and 1960s he applied his models in several areas: investments in people's competence, or human capital, behavior in households and families, crime and punishment, and discrimination in labor and other market. Nowadays government, workers, employers and all group of families keep on using his theory in economic activity for a better way of life. That summarizes the economic approach on Becker analysis. Thank you for your time and attention.